So this talk is uh, almost a discussion of a project that just finished. So I'm debriefing this project for myself as much as for everyone else. And the project is called cross-pollination, and it was named cross-pollination because a whole bunch of us, and the partners are listed at the bottom here, we're trying to cross-pollinate our ideas around sustainability and citizen science and teaching. And of course, we were interested in pollination as a biological process to explore some of these ideas. So that's where the title comes from. The project ran simultaneously in Italy and the UK, and I'm going to be focusing this talk on the UK side of the project, which was funded by the EPSRC. And well, in short, we started in November 2019, and then the school shut, and then they wouldn't let us in. And then they didn't find a lot of time for us, and then the project ended. So we didn't have it entirely our way. But this wasn't necessarily a bad thing in hindsight. And one of the things that did happen was, I said schools shut, but they didn't actually shut. They stayed open for very specific kinds of kids, so vulnerable kids and children of key workers. And at the same time, teachers were not so bound by the curriculum, and they were also encouraged and themselves keen to spend more time outdoors. The weather was nice too. And so we ended up getting a lot of interest from schools trying to find things to do with children with special needs. You know, the kind of kids you always struggle to get participating in your project. We suddenly got a lot of these up front. And then there was, of course, was all that homeschooling. So we had to rethink the project several times, and we found. So if you remember at the start of the pandemic, there were all of these articles coming out about social inequities with respect to access kids have to nature, and how a lack of access to nature in the lockdown impacts on science learning and impacts on well-being and all of these things. And then we hadn't thought very carefully about barriers to participation in the citizen science project. And from our early communications with teachers, it was clear we needed to sort that bit out. And then, of course, we realized we're not going to get very much face-to-face access. So we had to think of a way of doing things online. And this happened initially in quite an ad hoc way. So many of us in the team were homeschooling at the time, and everyone was desperate for these A4 size activity sheets that would sort of give your children something to do for a couple of hours. And we put some of these up quite quickly. And we know that teachers email these to their students, but we hadn't really put together any mechanism for monitoring what happened with these sheets. So it was a kind of a public service more than research at that point. And the big shift we needed to make was we had to interact with teachers online. And this had advantages. You could interact with more teachers than in face-to-face. But it also meant we lost a little bit of control with respect to how the project played out. And essentially, we found our project priorities evolving. We figured quite early that we have quite a diverse bunch of kids wanting to participate. And this is only possible if there were different ways in which they could participate. So we had to design flexibility into our methods. And we increasingly started asking ourselves, why should a school just be a car park and a football pitch? So there's so much schools could do to provide the equitable access to nature that's kind of missing in this country. So our focus moved a little bit towards changing what schools look like. And then this came from the kids. They didn't just want to learn and do citizen science. They actually wanted to campaign and be activists. And they were rather good at it. So we So this was not something we thought of at the start. We found ourselves asking ourselves what we can do to help kids communicate what it is that they're learning and doing. And through our conversations with the teachers and their conversations with the kids, we found through these 3 years that we were talking less and less about curriculum delivery as we went along, and we are talking more about collaboration and addressing together the big questions that matter today. And that was kind of nice. So getting back to the beginning, what is citizen science? And the Oxford English Dictionary now has a definition of citizen science, and it talks about scientific work undertaken by members of the general public, often in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. And I guess the key bit that's not completely described here is what scientific work means. And Muki Hartley had a go at this in 2011, and he talked about different categories of scientific work, and he organized them as a pyramid. So at the bottom, you ask citizens to do fairly mundane tasks that don't require a huge amount of skill. And he called that crowdsourcing, as citizens as sensors, data collection. And then you can use similar methods to get them to do some basic interpretation, like image classification in Galaxy Zoo and things like that. And you can essentially, with modern technologies and the internet, get lots of people participating at those levels. If you want citizens to participate more in the scientific process by defining the problem for which they're collecting data, or even analyzing the data at the end of it, then you require more skills in your citizen base, and you end up getting fewer and fewer participants. And we found that what we thought of as citizen science didn't map very clearly to what's in the literature. And I think we differed in a few ways. We were quite keen to use citizen science as a kind of cultural lever. So not just for doing science, but to also promote engagement and action around sustainability. So one step beyond just the science. And we were also thinking of citizen science not as data-driven scientific work, but more as an opportunity for improving education or learning. And we found ourselves thinking less and less about the data and the scientific work, and more about what it means to enable equitable participation and equitable benefits in citizen science. So that's a slightly different slant to the Oxford University Press dictionary. So I mentioned we were focusing on pollination, and there's a few reasons for this. Pollination is already taught in the science curriculum, and that makes it easier to engage schools around it. It's something that's very easy to study in school grounds, and that's nice. And it's actually quite easy to create your own inquiries around as a kid. And it's a useful window to start exploring several sustainability issues because the project itself focused on biological processes. But pollination as a process is kind of central to food security and forestry and biodiversity and all the employment that depends on that. And so there's a kind of bigger story you can work your way into by starting out here. So essentially what we came up with in cross-pollination is a cycle for actionable citizen science, where you first learn about pollinators and pollination, and then you do some scientific recording about what pollinating insects are visiting flowers in a patch. And you use that to try and create some extra habitat for the pollinators that are visiting. And this came from the kids, you get very excited and you tell everyone about it. And that's the sort of cycle. And initially, we were thinking more in terms of, can we design tools for citizen science that schools can use? And this has kind of expanded out quite a bit from that initial EPSRC project that got funded. So I'll quickly go through the 4 steps and the tools that we have, and I won't say too much about it because I know you've scheduled another talk for next month, which talks a little bit more about the interfaces and the technologies. So yeah, uh, uh, so one of the shifts we were making in this project is going from data gathering to learning. And we made the shift with species identification as well. So here's a picture of a bumblebee, and we provided kids with a visual feature filter where they could spot things they saw on the bumblebee. And then we provided them with an interface to automated image recognition, which would give them the 3 most likely species. And essentially, the kids could enter into a dialogue with this AI. If they told it that's the thorax, the AI would refine its predictions to only include things with that thorax. So you could keep changing your filters and keep getting feedback from the AI and have this conversation to help you figure out what it is that Bumblebee is. And I'll leave it at that. The other thing we did is we worked with the UK-wide pollinator monitoring schemes to design a pollinator survey that can work with schools, but also collects data in exactly the format that the UK-wide recording groups need. And it's called the FIT count, and it's run by the Center for Ecology and Hydrology. So there is proper scientific data collection happening here. And then we had some tools for getting kids to think about what to plant. And this comes from data we collected on a previous citizen science project called Bee-Watch. And essentially, you can select a species of bumblebee you saw in your school, and it tells you what the most commonly spotted flowers are with respect to this bee species. So you can start thinking about the specific plants you might need to plant to encourage the species that you see in your school. So that's a kind of visual tool for exploring these interactions between plants and insects. And then we had no real thinking about the communication side of things. And very early on, one of our participating schools came up with this idea of a pollinator promise. And eventually, they were going around encouraging people to pledge a piece of land for pollinator-friendly plants. And the school was, in the big orange dot at the bottom near Portsmouth, in a place called Havant. And we put it up on our website, and it very quickly started gathering pledges from all across the UK, and then from further afield as well. And Ofsted visited the school during the pandemic and gave them an outstanding rating for personal development at the time when Ofsted was particularly grumpy with schools, so they were quite kicked about that. And why personal development? I think the kids kind of explain this better than I could. So I'll share this video for a couple of minutes.
Hello, we are St Albans School from Havant, and we've started an amazing and fun project called Pollinator Promise. In our school, we have lots of different sections for pollinators, bugs, and other insects. Everyone in the school is involved.
We plant pollinators because 80% of our food comes from them, and without them, we'd be left without a lot of things.
We work together by doing it in buddies, and we all help each other. We all do it in one big team.
Every break time, I now go out to look at the bee wall that I made with my granddad, and it just makes me very happy to look at it.
It is important to help the wildlife because they're homeless and hungry, and they need our help.
Pollinators have given me a voice. From 3 years ago, when I wouldn't speak to anyone, now I'm speaking to big groups, over 300.
This project has been a big success, and you can get involved with it in your garden.
You can be any age to do this. You can even be as old as my great nan. I inspired her to join the Pollinator Promise, and she's done it in her garden where she lives. You can inspire your local businesses or your MP. You can help us by planting pollinator-friendly flowers, letting your grass grow long, and not using pesticides.
Okay, and essentially that was it, encouraging people to plant a meter by meter square of pollinator-friendly plants. So talking about what we achieved in this project, we are aware of around 3,000 participants in the project. We engaged with around 200 teachers. These numbers are across Italy and the UK, and around half come from the UK, and around 2,800 students. These are the ones that we are aware of. So the students are the ones that teachers reported back to us, and there are quite likely more that we are not aware of. The schools recorded over 5,000 pollinating insects on their grounds through their surveys. And the kids managed to get poly promises from around the world to put together over 5,000 square meters of pollinator-friendly habitat. With respect to practice, we've created a bunch of tools and surveys that can be used by kids in schools. And we've made some progress into teaching sustainability in schools through citizen science. So that's a kind of quick overview of where we think. We're still digesting the project a little bit, but I think that's kind of where we're at. So I'm taking that a little bit further. Most of what we know comes through what the teachers told us. And essentially, we found the teachers are very happy to pick and choose different elements from our cycle of citizen science. And they also had some strong ideas on where to start in that cycle. So some wanted to start with the planting. So survey the school grounds, find good places to plant things, places with sun, places next to hedgerows, so on and so forth. While others liked the technology more and they wanted to start with the species identification and getting kids to understand something about pollinators and biodiversity. Also, the schools were adopting a lot of things at that time, and teachers really tried not just to use what we gave them as an entire lesson, but use it as part of some learning exercise which worked for them. So we got lots of feedback on how these adaptations had happened, usually by embedding it into something else or breaking it up into smaller bits. And they also reported that they found the project useful for completely unrelated things like computing and personal development. And I think that video you just saw hinted at how both could progress to this. So essentially, I think we found that having this flexibility in a project where there's different ways in which you could participate was kind of key for allowing everyone to participate. And we found that people who entered through something which they liked often went on to do the other things. So many of the schools ended up doing the surveys, though if we had just approached them asking them to do surveys, at that point in time, they might have just said no. So yeah, so they found their own way to involve themselves in field studies and data-driven science. They didn't necessarily start with that. And we found kind of similar things from what they report about what the students did. And quite specifically, they reported that there was a lot of stress in schools at that time, and getting your hands dirty with gardening was really helpful for many of these kids. But equally, there were neurodiverse kids who really enjoyed learning to identify species, and that's all they wanted to do. So that, I mean, this is stuff that we weren't thinking of when we started the project. We had hoped children would come up with their own ideas and inquiries, but given we really struggled to enter schools, we couldn't push this as far as we wanted. But we heard of two examples of data collection exercises kids came up with themselves. The first is they measured the diameters of different bamboo tubes in their bee hotels. And as a consequence, they were able to see which bee species nested in which diameters of tubes. And they did a follow-up where they looked at predatory insects and which diameters the predators were able to access. And they also looked at whether insects prefer different colored flowers of the same plant. So quite cute studies that are easy to do in school grounds. And then we found that children really enjoyed the campaigning aspect of this. They contacted their MPs. They even triggered a parliamentary conversation. They created seed packets based on their learning. They selected the seeds and the numbers, and they gave them out in their communities. They launched a poly promise, and so on and so forth. So now, from what I've described so far, despite sustainability being in the title of this talk, we didn't kind of directly address sustainability. We use citizen science to explore biological relationships and ecological processes, and to some extent, the human impact on these and how you can mitigate that. And we kind of let the sustainability aspect come out of these conversations. And unsurprisingly, for a citizen science project, I think most of our participants saw sustainability as the first option here, as little things they could do that makes a difference. And that's fair enough. And that's actually very useful because the kids could see that planting this wildflower meadow in their school almost immediately started attracting pollinators. So you could see the impact of what it is you do. But it's worth noting that sustainability is also a global agenda, and you can't make progress just through individual actions. And of course, the kids showed some awareness of this by contacting MPs and triggering parliamentary conversations as well. So the global agenda is perhaps best illustrated by the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN calls it a framework for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. There are 17 goals, and they cover human development targets around poverty and hunger and education and stuff. They cover topics about equality, and then they cover topics about the environment and protecting the environment. And these goals are written in such a way that it's very easy to relate what you do to them. But then the goals also come with 169 targets and 231 indicators, and these are a means of monitoring progress on the goals. Then it really gets quite bureaucratic and top-down, and you struggle to see how a small citizen science project like ours can work with that infrastructure. So, I mean, we think we've engaged with at least 3 of these SDGs in spirit: life on land, with respect to creating habitats and taking action for pollinators, and quality education by thinking about new ways of teaching sustainability, for example, and also reducing inequality, by including young people in conversations around these global challenges, and 2, by trying to reimagine schools as equitable spaces for experiencing nature and the outdoors. The UN web pages themselves talk about pollinators contributing to 15 of the 17 SDGs because of how central they are to so much of global development. So clearly we could try and link a project like this to more of the SDGs. But that's us. What do the schools think? At the end of the project, we went to a school fair, and we put up this little poster, and we asked people what they thought. And basically, none of the students had ever heard of the SDGs. And we sent a survey out later to the other schools, and that was pretty much the case. Not a surprise, because in England, there's no mention of the SDGs or even sustainability in the curriculum yet. There is talk about it. Some of the parents had heard of the SDGs, and they thought the project was relevant to 12 of them. But then when you asked the participants in the project what impact they thought they could make by taking part in projects like this, they were clearly excited about it, and they thought projects like this can change the world. So then we explained what SDGs were to them. And then we asked them how it is they would like to contribute to these, if at all they would. And around 2/3 felt that they would like to contribute towards these global goals. And it wasn't necessarily through the monitoring mechanisms of collecting data. They were, I mean, through the project, I think this was not a surprise either. They were much more enthusiastic about communicating what they were learning and translating that into action in some way. So I personally have some mixed feelings about this. And it's nice to align what you do to these global agendas, but it's very unclear to me how you can meaningfully contribute towards the monitoring processes in these things. And fundamentally, there is some tension between the top-down and the bottom-up approaches. And if you're not careful, you can end up constraining what you allow citizens to do in your project by kind of making them subservient to the requirements of a global agenda. And it's also the case that the kids were quite focused on their local contexts, and you might distract from them by bringing in a global agenda into it. So just some final thoughts. I think it came through quite clearly that the kids enjoyed participating. They enjoyed it a lot. And the teachers report back to us that they were excited to be contributing to real science to the field surveys. They were excited that scientists were coming to them for help in their projects. But also, the project, as it panned out, was not particularly prescriptive. So they felt quite empowered and listened to. And they felt that the project was responding to what they were doing in it. And they especially enjoyed the fact that they could take their learning and translate it into stuff they enjoyed, actions and activism. So essentially, we now think of citizen science not just as a tool for doing science or getting scientific work done by citizens, but also a process for epistemic justice, where these questions of what knowledge is important and what can you do with it are not determined just by scientists, but are determined by the people it impacts on. And I think I'll stop there. There is a paper where these thoughts are presented perhaps slightly more coherently than I did today. And it indicates many of the people who contributed to the thoughts I expressed here as well. And it'd be nice to have a chat about this, because many of you definitely know more about education than I do. And many of you probably know more about the other two aspects as well. So thanks for listening.